systems, climate change will have wide-ranging impacts on our health. That is much more difficult to predict than the impacts more directly in terms of infectious diseases. We're getting there, I guess. So that was probably about as far as I could go with that one. Speak up a bit. So I will try. So I think you're going to have another talk about heat and physical activity, but there are a couple of factors of heat that I thought were worth pointing out. So most of you will remember the terrible bushfires in Victoria in February 2009. But what you might not be aware of is that bushfires were part of the impacts of a massive heat wave that affected southeastern Australia for more than 2 weeks. And during that heat wave, this shows ambulance or emergency department attendances, but the then Chief Health Officer released a report looking at the impact of the heat wave on mortality and found that there was probably an excess 374 deaths in Victoria during that heat wave. So the heat wave itself actually killed more people than the fires. So who did the heat wave kill? Looking around the audience, you may not be too pleased to hear that the majority of the people who died in that heat wave were aged 65 years or over. So some people have argued that is it all that the heat waves are doing is accelerating somebody's death within a few months. But there have now been a number of studies that have shown if that was the case, what you would expect after the heat wave would be that the death rate would be lower. But in fact, that's not the case. So we know that these deaths that occur during the heat waves aren't necessarily just making people die a few months sooner than you would expect. They are actually deaths due to the heat, which can precipitate such things as heart attacks and strokes, as well as getting the direct impacts of the heat itself. And just worth remembering that it's not just humans who are affected by heat. Sadly, flying foxes are too. You might know that around 23,000 flying foxes died in Cairns late last year as a result of their unprecedented heat wave. But you also might be aware that flying foxes carry a form of rabies virus, Australian bat lyssavirus, and it's a very low risk, of course. But what we do find is that during heat waves, flying foxes, because they're stressed, fly lower. We tend to get a lot more bat exposures, bites and scratches during heat wave or hot conditions, because the flying foxes are not adapted to such high levels of heat. So extreme events are again something that you might think of as affecting health, and they certainly do. So while we're experiencing, certainly in the southern part of Australia, much drier conditions, we also know that we will experience and are already experiencing more extreme rainfall conditions. And an example of this was the one in a 1,000-year event in Townsville recently. And the reason why I'm showing this photo is that you can see these people walking through the floodwater with their bare legs. So there's a couple of infections that, so we have the impacts, the direct impacts of floods. So I think there were 3 people who died during the Townsville floods, which fortunately is quite low considering the level of flooding. But together with flooding comes other risks, one of which is leptospirosis. So following the Brisbane and southeast Queensland floods in 2011, there was an outbreak of leptospirosis in southern Queensland, particularly around the Darling Downs. And walking through flood waters with bare skin is one. And then you might be aware that there's been an outbreak of melioidosis also in Townsville, which is a bacteria that occurs naturally in soil, but when in muddy conditions, that's when people get exposed. And again, if you're elderly or have diabetes or other chronic conditions, you're more susceptible to melioidosis. I show this because it's to remind us that the floods extended far beyond and that we lost a very large, I think it's been estimated around 500,000 head of cattle. And that brings me to one of the very important impacts of climate change on health, which relates to our food security. So impacts of flooding such as that, you know, we not only lose the cattle, but we also often lose a lot of the feed and so on. It can take many, many years for agricultural systems to recover from floods such as this. So together with heat and dryness comes wildfires. So this wildfires in California, I know it's a long way from southeast Queensland, but some of the lessons from the Californian fires were that this, as has been experienced, was experienced in Victoria, was their first experience of catastrophic fires, fires that they couldn't control, number one. Number two, it occurred in November, in autumn. Number three, there were 86 people who died outright. Whole towns were written off. But the other thing was the impact of the smoke. So the smoke extended right across the San Francisco Bay Area and lasted for several weeks. So people were walking around with masks and so on. From what I can see to date, the health impact of that smoke has not been documented, but we do know that on this particular day, that this is in Sacramento, this photo was taken. Sacramento was the most polluted town or city in the world at that point. So air pollution causes respiratory diseases, we know that, and can precipitate asthma and exacerbations of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, but also can trigger cardiovascular disease and strokes. So it's highly likely that during these fires, a very large number of people actually either died or were made ill as a result of the smoke. So living in this part of the world, we tend not to have many fires in the summer months, but we can expect that we will have more as our summers get drier and hotter, and that all over Brisbane, particularly in the western parts of Brisbane, I imagine will be much more susceptible to this type of smoke. And again, very far from southeast Queensland, but you might remember the massive heat wave that occurred across Eastern Europe in 2010. And this was Moscow during that time. So there was a heat wave that basically destroyed Russia's wheat crop, and Russia was the largest exporter of wheat in the world. It caused wheat prices to rise, which made our farmers happy, but had major impacts on many people's nutrition around the world. And there were massive fires. And it was estimated that as a result of both the fires, the heat and the smog, that around 56,000 people died in Russia as a result of that particular weather event. So we can have massive impacts. And again, going back to nutrition, we know that the projections are of an increasingly drier Murray-Darling Basin. We're seeing terrible effects on that in terms of fish deaths and so on. But of course, this is our big food bowl for our fruit and veggies. So when I was head of public health, we had the Go for 2 and 5 campaign, and our nutritionists were very excited because they, as a result of this campaign and a lot of effort, after about a year, we managed to increase, according to our surveys, the consumption of fruit and vegetables by 1 serve per day. Now, that may not seem like much, but on a population basis, that's a big deal. But then the next time we did it, then the consumption was lower. And what we think we understand happened because they did further surveying, that it was the increased cost of the fruit and vegetables as a result of the millennium drought that meant that people, while they did switch towards fruit and veggies, will then switch away. So again, those of us who have deeper pockets are able to pay more for our fruit and veg, but again, on a population basis, this has big impacts on our health. So if we look at so far the impacts of climate as well as population growth on our food supply, you will see that those that are below the zero line are those that are net importers of food. We are actually increasing, but over time we expect that things will get a little tighter in terms of the overall food balance around the world as a result of our changing, more unstable climate. I just put this up to remind us that I'm sure you're all aware of the major coral bleaching events that have occurred so far. We've lost about 50% of the inner Great Barrier Reef. And the reason why I put this up in terms of health, apart from the heartbreak, relates again to our impacts on our fisheries. So we know that nutritionists recommend people eating fish, but fish are becoming increasingly in short supply. For us, fisheries are more of a luxury. For many people in the world, it's their major source of protein. So it's hard to talk about climate change without talking about sea level. So this is the latest. It's from that same report that our previous speaker, Michael Hewson, referred to, but we are seeing accelerating increase in sea level, which again is not surprising. And what this will ultimately result in is a massive displacement if people are unable to adapt to these sea level rises. So you can see now Brisbane's not on that list, but there will be parts of Brisbane that will be potentially displaced also as a result of sea level. And this massive global displacement of people can't but impact on our social and economic systems around the world. We're already seeing the massive impacts of global displacement as a result of wars and droughts. Sea level rise will also have that impact. And just a reminder that many parts of the world are already seeing this. This is on Kiribati, the entrance to the maternity ward. So back to infectious diseases. This is a little hard to read, but what this is a distribution of probably from a public health perspective, two of the most important mosquito vectors. One on the left, Aedes aegypti, that occurs in far north Queensland, and one on the right, Aedes albopictus, that occurs so far in the Torres Strait. The thing about this fellow is that it can survive much lower temperatures. It's a hardier and more aggressive biter, so it's not as good at transmitting dengue fever, but it's very good at transmitting Zika virus, chikungunya and others. So the blue bits is relative to time, the distribution. When it gets orange is where the distribution has increased in each of these countries. And so the main message from this is in many parts of the world, the distribution of these mosquitoes has changed to more temperate regions and become more populous in others. Now the mosquito story is a complicated one because with climate change, when the temperatures get warmer, so in more temperate areas, you often are more likely to see, and we're already seeing this with Aedes albopictus and aegypti, mosquitoes encroaching into those areas. But as it gets hot and dry, we actually also, that's not good for mosquitoes. So in parts of southeast Queensland, we may actually see fewer mosquitoes, not more, but it's a difficult, complicated picture that's hard to predict. So in terms of our future climate, I've listed a number of things here, or this is from the State of the Climate report. So basically, as from our perspective, as you already heard, hotter and drier, but when we have rain, heavier rain, fewer tropical cyclones, but more high-intensity storms and more fire weather danger days. So our climate affects everything that we do. So in terms of our health, it's difficult to be specific, except for some of the things that I've mentioned, but through these physical impacts, how we feel the temperature, how we experience the weather, that impacts on us. But then their impact on us at a community level in terms of our food growing areas, in terms of our impacts on infrastructure and so on, that end up costing us a lot of money. And then on a household level, more making food and so on more expensive, making increasing health risks for those older. So this quote is from a WHO report, and it's worth noting because we can talk about the acute impacts that we're talking about now, but in the long run, the greatest risks will be from the slow build-up of pressures on our natural, economic and social systems that sustain our health. So when we look at the fact that now our life expectancy at birth is in the 80s, but it wasn't that long ago that our life expectancy at birth was much, much lower, 45 to 50. In the lifetime of some of you, that was the life expectancy at birth. And what has had the biggest impact on that? Sure, we've got better health care, But a big part of that increase in our life expectancy has been improving in our social and economic systems, basically. We live in better housing, we have access to better or higher quality food, we have less stress, we have better education. And it's these things that climate change can ultimately impact on, even in places like middle-class Brisbane. So the Lancet Commission on Health was the second of 2 reports that the Lancet has sponsored looking at the health impacts of climate change. The first one was published in 2009, the second one in 2015. The second one, they tried to turn it around because they found if they just talked about the bad stuff, people just switched off. So in the 2015, one of the things that, apart from saying that it's potentially catastrophic for our survival, reversing the gains in development and a medical emergency, there also are benefits in taking action beyond stopping climate change. So this is a figure from that. So it's a little complicated, and I see this room is not geared towards it very well. But the first bit is the direct effects that I've talked a bit about: drought, heat waves, floods, strong winds. And then there's the indirect effects, some of which I haven't spoken about, things like water quality. So when water is few, sparse, less of it, then water quality gets worse. And when there are floods, water quality gets worse. So put those things together: poorer water quality, air pollution, not only from fires, but from increased temperatures, getting increased surface ozone and other air pollutants, land use change, increasing amounts of dust and so on, and ecological changes that I'm sure you'll hear more about. And then those impact a lot on our social dynamics as well. Our socio-economic systems, how we relate to each other, our socio-economic status, our public health infrastructure and so on, leading to a range of different health impacts that go way beyond infectious diseases, such as cardiovascular disease, undernutrition, allergies, and mental health impacts, which I haven't spoken a lot about, but it's important to consider those. So I went to the COP24 in Poland as part of a small health contingent, and there the World Health Organization released this special report on health and climate change. And within that report is a similar pitch way of talking about it, the direct, the indirect effects, and it has effects on those systems, but also their mediating factors. So development in developing countries, for a perspective, can be a mediating factor, because our social systems and resilience and stuff, we can make a mediating or we can neglect them, and it can be part of the problem. I hope that made sense. This is a bit, this graph is a bit old now. It's from the IPCC 5th Assessment Report. But basically, the triangle at the moment is where we are now. There's a number of different ways that climate change impacts on your health. The orange bits are the bits that they think that we can adapt to, whereas yellow is beyond our capacity to adapt. What the main message is, 1.5 degrees, which we're well on track to achieve by 2030. There's increasing each time it goes out. There's an increasing impact. Again, most of those impacts are still that we can adapt to, but now we see that there's some impacts we won't be able to adapt to as a population. And then we go to what they call then, but it's getting less because of our inaction over time, is the era of climate options, where these impacts are even greater. So again, those impacts are fairly far-reaching. So it's worth noting that the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees was released in time for the COP24, with a hope that world leaders would take note. From the perspective of health, there are a number of things where, from that report, that you can see impacts on health. So this graph is a little hard to understand a bit. Basically, the darker the colour, the greater the impact. On the bottom is a number of different risks, and on the top is what they call reasons for concern, which are things where they're talking about major climate impacts. The one I've circled there is the global aggregate impacts, which is basically about all the impacts of climate change in terms of world economic systems and so on. And as you can see, it's probably hard to see there, but there's 1.51. The grey area is kind of where we're at now, about 1 degree. The next step up is 1.5, and the step up again is 2. But as you can see, it gets pretty much all of these things get dramatically darker at 2 compared to 1.5. So the key message from that report, and it's been picked up by many, many people around the world, including health people, is that we need to heed those warnings and take dramatic changes in order to be able to protect our health and our human systems as well as our ecological systems. So that, I've got the wrap up, so then but basically this is our fossil fuel emissions that are continuing to increase. Whoops. And this is the message about, again from the Lancet Commission, that by taking action on climate change, we also improve our health. This is particularly in relation here to air pollution, reduced air pollution and other pollutants when we switch to renewables. So there's many benefits from switching to renewables. But it also, if we reduce our transport, we get better public and active transport. If we eat healthier diets, then it's likely we will result in fewer emissions, improved health lives and health care. So how are you feeling right now? I hope you're not in this bucket, but it's hard not to be. And I have to say that even though I spend a lot of my waking hours thinking about climate change, it's hard not to be in that left space. Fear, anxiety, irritation, anger, rage, etc. The message of this is that taking action actually also helps us feel better. It's good for our mental health, and you guys being together, getting to talk and think about it as a group is part of that, and I congratulate you for that. So the Royal Australasian College of Physicians, which I'm a fellow of, is taking action just to show that how strong the support is from the health sector for action. And that, I'll leave you with the link to the Lancet Commission on Health and Climate in case you're interested. It's worth a read. Thank you.
When you're talking about climate change and the impact, I think there's a perception that there's where we are now and then there'll be a new normal. Are you describing a new normal, or are you describing a state on a continued problem?
It's a state on a continuing problem. We talk about, the Climate Council has talked about a new normal because in terms of our angry summers, basically the point being that this is what, for example, the summer we've just experienced is likely to be the summer that we will continue. But of course, as global average temperatures increase, it's not going to be that nice. It's going to get worse. And that's the point, and that's the key point about the urgency of trying to limit to 1.5 degrees. But I have nightmares about 1.5 degrees, to be honest. But it'll be a hell of a lot better than 2 and more, which is why it's so urgent to take action.
Anybody else? Yes?
Yeah, I know it's not our backyard, but I know that there's been a lot of reports that come out of Mongolia this year of the issues of the Zud, or the dangers that have happened, and that country is certainly being subjected to it, and as a result they've got displacement of people into the only major centre in Ulaanbaatar, which is also having an ongoing effect in relation to the increasing pollution because of the burning of coal for heating. And so I think that's one of the things that people aren't realising, is that countries like Mongolia and that the effects are huge. Yeah, it's good to remind ourselves of that. And I think, my reason, because I was in a rush, the whole thing about displacement, there's a lot of displacement that's already occurred during climate change, due to climate change. Most of it is happening internally within countries. People who talk about the war in Syria, and it clearly wasn't just that, because they have an oppressive government and so on, but a huge amount of internal displacement into the cities as a result of an ongoing drought was part of what then triggered. So some of these things can trigger conflict which are multifaceted. And even within our own country, if we think about, if we were to play our role, and now I'm talking politically, many of you may not agree, but I think if we were to play our role in terms of accepting refugees, that we probably should, then there will be, as is seen in Europe and others, increased conflict and so on, even in amongst ourselves. So it's every time we disrupt populations and so on, and you get
you know, a lot more stress, a lot more other impacts, and we can't, you know, over time, I don't think we'll be able to continue to say no as massive numbers of people need to move.
I just would like
One more?
Yeah. Your expert view on, I know we can't predict the future, but you've obviously thought about what's this leading to. In this finite planet, there is only a certain amount of raw materials and, you know, timber and water. And when it comes to the crunch, and someone hasn't got any fresh water to drink, or they haven't got any water to put on their vegetables or feed their animals with or anything like that, this could cause conflict. And maybe they'll move to somewhere where there is water. But you know, the one major water source of Australia, the Murray, is in jeopardy. And we don't need to go into the real reason, but you know, that we're selling all this water off to grow cotton, which, you know, doesn't feed anybody. And there are apparently 3 big reservoirs the size of Sydney Harbour full of water that should be in the Murray, the Darling. So, you know, when it comes to crunch, and our population meantime, when I was young, 21, there were 3.5 billion on the planet. Now, you know, more than 7 billion, it's going to 9 billion. More pressure on the fewer resources. I mean, there's going to be conflict of some sort, isn't it?
Well, probably. I'd say so. I think a lot of it depends on what we do now. One, in relation to our emissions, but secondly, the world. You know, we have to be part of the world players. And I have to say, I'd certainly kept in touch with the COPs before the Conference of the Parties and UNFCCC meetings, but I hadn't actually been to one until the one last year. But Australia isn't a great player on the global stage, regardless of which government is in power, although the previous government was very much in support of the Green Climate Fund that we are now no longer chairing because we withdrew from it. But the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms to provide funding and support to other countries of low and middle income countries is actually a critical part of the equation. One, to help them to reduce their emissions, but also to assist them in adapting. Because birth control is actually an important adaptation, climate adaptation that many people in the world currently don't have access to. So we need to be part of the solution, not just for here but elsewhere. But that's important also for our national security, not just into, you know, so there's an element of self-interest in there as well.
Margaret, sorry.
No, wait, sorry, we're going to have to move on, but don't forget we've got the panel session at the end, so you'll be able to ask Linda some questions then. Thanks very much, Linda.